The letter arrived on a bright Monday morning, tucked neatly inside a plain white envelope. At first glance, it looked harmless, but when David opened it, his hands froze. A fine. Not just any fine, but $70,000. His eyes darted back to the page, thinking surely it was a typo. But the words were bold and cruel. HOA violation. Due immediately. His stomach sank. David had lived in his cabin for years, quiet and peaceful, never bothering anyone. He loved the lake nearby, the tall trees, the winding road that led to his home. Yet the HOA president, a sharp-tongued woman named Karen, seemed to find reasons to attack him at every turn. This fine, though, was the biggest blow yet. He folded the paper slowly, his heart beating steady but heavy. On the surface, he seemed calm, but inside, a storm brewed, because there was one detail Karen and her HOA board had forgotten, a detail David had carefully kept in his back pocket. That winding road, the only way into the entire neighborhood, wasn't theirs. It was his. He owned it, every single inch of gravel and dirt. David set the letter down, looked out his cabin window, and whispered to himself, "They want to fight? Then they'll get one." By the end of the week, Karen showed up at David's driveway, clipboard in hand, sunglasses perched proudly on her face. She spoke as if her words carried the weight of law. "David, you've ignored the HOA's previous notices. This fine isn't optional. If you don't pay, we'll escalate." David leaned against his porch railing, silent, letting her words echo through the trees. He noticed how she strutted, how she believed her position gave her power. The HOA board members stood behind her like soldiers, nodding in agreement. $70,000 for what? Exactly? David asked finally, his voice steady. "For neglecting common standards," she shot back. "Your driveway isn't compliant, your mailbox is outdated, and your cabin doesn't match the color scheme." The absurdity nearly made David laugh, but he bit his tongue. Instead, he nodded slowly, as if he were considering her demands. "You're very confident," he said quietly. "But tell me, Karen, what would happen if tomorrow morning none of your residents could drive out of here?" Her face twitched with confusion. The board members exchanged uncertain glances. But David didn't explain. Not yet. He simply turned and walked back into his cabin, leaving Karen speechless in the autumn air. That evening, David pulled an old leather folder from his desk drawer. Inside was a stack of carefully preserved documents, deeds, maps, contracts. He unfolded the one that mattered most, the property deed for the only road leading in and out of the neighborhood. His late father had purchased it decades ago, long before the HOA ever existed. Now, that road belonged solely to David. He ran his fingers across the paper, a faint smile tugging at his lips. The HOA believed they held all the cards, but they had built their kingdom on a road they didn't even own. Without access, their entire operation crumbled. The next morning, David drove his pickup truck to the start of the road and parked it sideways across both lanes. Neighbors stopped, honked, and shouted, but David just rolled down his window. "Private property," he said calmly, holding up the deed. "This road isn't HOA land. It's mine. And until certain debts are settled, no one drives past without my permission." Word spread like wildfire. Karen was furious, storming out in her polished heels, screaming about lawsuits and city codes. But when David held up the official paperwork, signed and stamped by the county, even she was momentarily speechless. The power dynamic had shifted, and everyone knew it. By midweek, chaos rippled through the neighborhood. Residents were trapped inside, unable to get to work or school without facing David's blockade. Delivery trucks turned away, mail piled up, tempers flared. The same neighbors who once ignored David now begged him to reconsider. But David stayed calm, explaining to each person who approached, "I don't want your money. I just want fairness. The HOA fined me $70,000 for nonsense violations. Until that fine is erased and this harassment stops, the road stays closed." Karen, however, saw things differently. She called an emergency HOA meeting on someone's front lawn. Her voice carried sharp across the crowd. "He's bluffing. That deed can't possibly hold up. We'll take him to court. No one man can control our entire neighborhood. Yet in the crowd, whispers grew. What if he wasn't bluffing? What if the HOA had overstepped too far? Residents began questioning Karen's leadership for the first time. The very people who once cheered her on were now staring at her with doubt. And as the sun set behind the lake, David stood quietly at the edge of the road, watching. He didn't need to argue. The deed in his hand was louder than any words Karen could shout. The HOA tried intimidation next. A few members marched up to David's cabin, waving letters and threatening police action. But when officers arrived, David calmly handed them the deed. The officers studied it, exchanged glances, and finally nodded. He's within his rights, one of them admitted. This is private property. Karen's face turned red. She demanded the officers do something, but they shook their heads and left. The power she thought she wielded had dissolved in an instant. Meanwhile, David's blockade stood firm. Days stretched into a week, and frustration boiled over in the neighborhood. Without deliveries, conveniences, or easy access, residents began to realize just how dependent they were on that single stretch of road, and how much power David truly held. One evening, as the sky painted itself orange and gold, Karen stomped down the road once again, her voice shrill. "You're holding this entire community hostage." David met her eyes calmly. "No, Karen. You held me hostage with false fines, threats, and harassment. I'm just showing you what real leverage looks like." Karen tried everything. She filed complaints, sent angry emails, even attempted to rally residents against David. But cracks had already formed in her empire. Families began turning on her, furious that her greed and arrogance had dragged them into this mess. At a heated neighborhood gathering, one father shouted, "You fined him $70,000 for nothing. Now my kids can't even get to school. You caused this, Karen." For the first time, Karen had no comeback. Her usual smirk faded. The board members who once stood beside her slowly stepped back, distancing themselves from her chaos. Her power was slipping like sand through her fingers. David, on the other hand, remained patient. He didn't gloat, didn't raise his voice. He simply repeated his terms. Erase the fine. Stop the harassment. Respect property rights. That's all. By the end of the week, Karen was cornered. She knew if she didn't yield, she'd lose the entire neighborhood's trust, and possibly her position as HOA president. Finally, under immense pressure, Karen caved. The HOA formally withdrew the $70,000 fine, issuing a letter of apology. They promised to leave David's cabin alone, acknowledging his ownership of the road. David moved his truck, reopening the path. Neighbors cheered, relief flooding the air. Some even walked up to thank him personally. For the first time in years, David felt like part of the community again. Not because of Karen's rules, but because he had stood firm for what was right. Karen, humiliated and powerless, resigned from her position soon after. The once feared president was now just another neighbor, quiet and subdued. David looked out at the open road that evening, the lake shimmering in the distance. He hadn't wanted war, but sometimes standing up was the only way forward. The HOA had tried to break him with fines and threats, but in the end, it was their own arrogance that cost them everything. With a faint smile, David whispered to himself, "Never underestimate the man who owns the road."